I'm good.
Hope this works. All right. We are live. Okay. Welcome to Contextualize This. I am Viviana joined by my co-host Arlene Santana, actress and producer. And we are very excited to have the esteemed Dr. Leo Chavez of UCI, anthropologist and expert on international immigration. Thank you, Dr. Chavez, for joining us.
No, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
We are familiar with your work. You do a lot of work with symbols and with images and how they're connected to stereotypes, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to congratulate you too as well for being the recent recipient of the prestigious Bronislaw Malinowski Award for Applied Anthropology. It's a big deal in the anthropology world because not only does Dr. Chavez do a lot of research, but he actually makes a big impact in the community with social science and really affecting how we view a lot of really complicated issues. So congratulations, Dr. Chavez.
Which is so important right now, doctor. So you're doing God's work.
Now, we were going to jump right into immigration, and we will, but I have to take the opportunity to talk with you about Trump's recent positive test for coronavirus and the type of care, healthcare he's going to be receiving as opposed to the major group of population, the rest of us folks. You've done a lot of work with medical anthropology as well and sociology. So is he going to be getting the best care, and how different is it going to be from the rest of the country?
Well, number one, he's going to get the best care. There's no doubt about that. He's the president of the United States. And so he's going to get the best care you can possibly get in the world. I think the contradiction is that he's worked effectively and very strongly to deny healthcare to many millions of Americans, because he's worked very diligently to try and get rid of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. And as we all know, before Obamacare, there was something like 43 million Americans without healthcare. And to me, that's not the good old days. That's not the America we really want to go back to. But his administration has been working very diligently to reduce the kind of healthcare that many working class and low income Americans get. So, his healthcare is going to be something completely different from the kind of healthcare people without insurance can look forward to.
Even down to getting tested right away, right? I mean, he got tested immediately. He knows. He can even do some preemptive care, I imagine, at this point.
Well, I think the issue will be how much will he listen to his doctors? I mean, he likes to take some of these strange kind of drugs that aren't proven for coronavirus. He even talked about, intravenous shots of bleach at one point. So, will he listen to his doctors, or will he basically demand some sort of strange, crazy kind of treatments, which may do more damage than good? And unfortunately, we probably won't know because we're not going to have access to a lot of, I think, what's happening in the White House in relationship to Trump and his healthcare. These are sort of things they've kept relatively secret. I mean, we don't really know what his health checkups are really like. Is he really healthy?
Right.
Has he had strokes? He made a big deal he didn't have strokes, but who asked if he had strokes? Which sort of makes you think, well, he brought it up. Why did he bring it up?
Exactly.
How's his heart? He's obese? How's his arteries? I mean, he's really lucky he doesn't smoke and he doesn't drink. Those are two really good positive risk factors, right? That go a long way to protecting your body. So, but he's got some other major ones. I mean, obesity is a big one, stress, and those are things that kind of lead you to being vulnerable to the kind of negative impacts of coronavirus.
And Dr. Chavez, I feel like it's also a little bit of an insult to us, the people that are having to be part of like essential workers. He's also promoting schools to reopen, and yet here he is about to face, I would say, a huge health endeavor, because to fight a deadly virus, no matter who you are, I think every body is different. So we don't know how he's gonna be affected by it in the long term. But the fact that he's promoting the economy to open back up and schools back up is just insulting.
No, it's ironic that he's been promoting all the negative ways of dealing with this virus. Don't wear masks, open up quickly, put our kids back in school. I mean, he's shown a complete disregard for the kind of health practices that our medical people have said that we need to do. And and I hate to say it, but sort of it's come home to roost at this point. I mean, you can't take those kind of lack precautions and expect to stay healthy. This virus doesn't care if you're president of the United States. It's going to basically attack you. If you allow yourself to be vulnerable, it's going to come after you. And that's basically what he's done.
There's a lot of talk.
Kind of feel
Go ahead.
for Melania, right? I feel kind of sorry for Melania. I think she was the only one of his family at the debate that was wearing a mask. So I can't imagine what their conversation is about right now.
She's going.
What the heck?
I want to feel bad for her, Dr. Chavez, but her the recent release of that audio recording of her cavalier and callous attitudes toward family separation. Keep in mind, that is when she wore that jacket that said, "I don't care, do you?" So, I'm going to manifest that same energy. I'm going to wear my jacket right now. I don't care, do you?
Well, birds of a feather flock together. So I guess her and Trump are a good match.
She sure seems to get along with what he said in that recording, just like mima birding everything that he said. All right, well, let's get it a little bit into immigration. We have a long history of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, and we've heard a lot of that, since the 2016 election and even in the last few years. But with the pandemic and with the 2020 election, there's been so many things going on. A lot of that rhetoric has died down, at least in the media. It really shows how much your work is like an accurate depiction of how immigration is used as a scapegoat and, pushed and pulled to their benefit. So we haven't heard a lot about like build the wall. Where are the chants? Has the threat been neutralized? What's going on?
No, I think that it hasn't been neutralized, but it's one of the biggest failures of his administration. I mean, he came in with people saying Mexico will pay for the wall. Mexico hasn't paid for the wall. In fact, the wall's been paid through shenanigans on his part, taking money from other military expenses that we really need and inserting it into building the wall. So I think that, I think he'd like to continue with this rhetoric of the wall and the border being dangerous, but in a way, it's been a big failure for his administration. I mean, that wall has not been built and Mexico hasn't paid for it. So I think he still uses the anti-immigrant rhetoric. You saw just the other day, he was in the Midwest talking about how brown refugees are going to come into the white Midwest states and destroy their communities. And so it's still a very prevalent part of his rhetoric, to tell you the truth. I think just building the wall, he hasn't mentioned that because it's a failure.
Dr. Chavez, can you elaborate a little bit about how that anti-immigrant sentiment is a useful tactic, how it's been used before within other political leaders, and how Trump has really used it in a way that's never been done before? And it's why I think he got elected. It was what ignited his campaign. It's how he launched his campaign back in 2015. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that and just give us a little bit about the history.
Well, I think the recent history, we can go back a long time because it's been a very useful tool for politicians to stereotype the other, the immigrant, as the problem. I mean, the front page of the LA Times, after the 1930 Depression started, was that Mexicans caused it. Mexican immigrants caused the Depression. I mean, that's ridiculous looking back now, but that's, they were looking for a scapegoat. But let's take just more recently. And I think when we saw it at the debate where Trump was reluctant to say anything negative about white nationalism, the anti-immigrant sentiment that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years has really been part of a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment that has emerged in Europe and the United States in relationship to demographic change. And so many people in the United States and Europe feel that they're being born out or reproduced out of their societies and nations, so that whites are becoming a minority in many places in Europe, in many places, and in the United States. This has fueled sort of a white nationalist backlash, both in the United States and in Europe. And that's where you have a lot of these white nationalist demonstrations and saying things like, "You will not replace us." Well, that's code word for saying, we're not going to let you make us into a brown Europe or a brown America. And, this has led to violence. It's led to all kinds of problems. And so it's the anti-immigrant rhetoric has been part of this sort of this surge in white nationalism that we've seen over the last 10, 20 years. That was a wave that Trump rode really into the election, and really in his race baiting was really effective to trying to getting people to think, wow, maybe America should stay white. Well, what are all these brown people coming into America trying to, to change us? And and it hit a chord with some people who were feeling pushed out, neglected by the media, you know, often portrayed as hillbillies and people who didn't understand them. So they were feeling, you know, that they were left out of the public discourse, and the media was treating them badly, and the economy was leaving them behind. I mean, the studies have shown that inequality has grown tremendously over the last 40, 50 years. And the white working classes felt that tremendously. They want someone to blame. And so immigrants become very easy to blame.
But how, go ahead, doctor.
I was saying, but I've shown some data that shows it's really a misnomer, because at every level of income, white Americans earn more than Latinos and Blacks, right? And even at the lowest levels, the middle levels, and the highest levels, white Americans earn more money than everyone else, right? And so to think that somehow they're being overtaken economically by everyone else is just completely wrong. But you know, facts don't matter. It's the feeling they have that they're being left out, they're being pushed out, and immigrants are sort of the scapegoat for those feelings. Not, interestingly enough, not politicians like Donald Trump, who have exacerbated their position, right? Because inequality has grown tremendously under Trump.
So and is married to an immigrant.
They don't, not only that, his parents, you know, he comes from an immigrant line. What's interesting about Trump is, you know, his German line, Germans were some of the most castigated groups in American history. And I can have a cartoon, and there, you can see a lot of these political cartoons back from the 1800s, where you have the Irish and the Germans, and this is sort of the connection to today, running off with the ballot box, being accused of fraud.
Wow.
And so here you have the same thing he's accusing, was being accused against his forefathers in this country, right? So these kind of ideas have a long history and don't ever seem to leave us in our political discourse.
It's kind of ironic, because it was sort of foretold some decades ago that because Latinos in general, our numbers were going to grow, that we would be the ones to become, you know, to want to secede and to become with our own little cultural group. And really, it's been the white supremacists have been those anti-government and all these sort of little militia groups within each other. So it's kind of the opposite of what they thought it would be. And now we have the president really bolstering their power. What do you make of him and his non-condemnation of white supremacy during the recent debate? Was that some sort of mistake? Did he misspeak, or was he intentionally telling these white supremacists to stand by?
He's very strategic. He's very careful. He understands clearly that they support him, and that's all he cares about. He sees them as people who are going to vote for him, and he's very reluctant to say anything negative about them. He hasn't, in the last 4 years, said anything negative about white terrorists and white extremist groups and creating violence. So he always deflects it to Antifa or some other group, immigrants, and he realizes it's not a mistake. I don't think he misspoke. These are his people. These are the people he sees as his base. He sees them as strong supporters, and he's already anticipating there's going to be some sort of issues related to the election, and he thinks these are the kind of people who are going to come forward to protect him. I mean, in a sense, you know, he may be even planning that they might be the front lines of a coup to keep him in office. I don't really think that's possible, mainly because no matter how many Proud Boys you have, another white supremacist group, the Army of the United States is a lot bigger and a lot stronger. And so I think it'd be a little bit difficult, but that's the image he wants to present, right? And he uses them very strategically for that purpose. And he has done that since before he was elected during the campaign back in 2015. That race baiting, that anti-immigrant hysteria, pandering to whites who feel left out. This has been very strategic. So I don't think his actions at the debate were a mistake. I mean, he's not going to come out and condemn people he sees as his supporters. That's his base.
He's not going to condemn white supremacy because he is a white supremacist, doctor, and he's using this group of people, he's inciting them and he's encouraging them to hate immigrants, to hate the others, like you mentioned, and it's having an effect. The repercussions are the El Paso shooting, where a white supremacist with his manifesto came forward and blatantly said that he wanted to kill immigrants, and he did. So
he did. And his manifesto used the word invasion multiple times. And basically Trump has used the word invasion hundreds, if not thousands of times in his ads and his discourse. And so, yeah, words matter. And he's fomenting through his rhetoric the kind of violence that we're seeing. And it's not just shooting people, it's everyday kind of violence, everyday antagonisms, where people will say, go back to Mexico, or where do you come from? Or it just was in the paper today. This guy his daughter brought his granddaughter over to his house, and a white woman next door came out and called the police and said he kidnapped this little girl because she had blondish hair, right? And it's just absurd. But that's the kind of behavior Trump's rhetoric gives license to. And unfortunately, it's become widespread. And so it ranges from just those everyday insults to murder. And it's unfortunate. I mean, just look what he did with this kid who shot people, comes to a rally, comes to a demonstration with a machine gun and shoots two people. And Trump says, well, maybe he was, defending himself. Well, if it was the other way around, if you had a black person or a brown person carrying a machine gun into a demonstration, somebody got killed, they'd be thugs, they'd be murderers, and we got to throw them in jail, right? And it's just, he just doesn't see that, right? He for him, it's just two different worlds that he views, and it's just really, I think it's just divisive and tears the country apart.
One of the things you mentioned about a possibility of a coup, or obviously he's already saying that he won't step down peacefully from office if he doesn't win this election. He also made reference to having people go watch the polls. Now, this seemed to me as code word to go pinpoint people that you think are not citizens. And I mean, has this ever happened before?
Oh, it definitely has happened before historically. But even more recently, back in the 80s and even early 90s, there were cases where the Republicans felt compelled to put in these people to go and look at the polls. And the problem was they don't just look at the polls, because there are people who are sort of are chosen to go and be poll monitors, right? They go in, they're verified, they do it. These people are promoted by people like Trump or the Republican Party or others. In the past, even the Democratic Party might have done it, 100 years ago. But today, it's the Republican Party that's so afraid of people actually voting, that people are going to be elected by people really voting, right? That they send these people to go really harass voters. They stand between their cars and the line to go and vote. They ask people for their papers who don't look like they look Mexican, basically, or look Latino, right? Particularly, and they just harass people who are citizens because they're there to vote. I testified in a case against the Republican Party here in Orange County a couple of decades ago. And it was a similar situation where they hired some people to come. They were actually pretended they were officers. I think they even carried guns, if I remember right. And they were asking Latinos if they were citizens and trying to intimidate them. So a lawsuit was brought by immigrant rights groups. I testified in that case. And we basically forced them to surrender. They basically conceded that they were wrong and gave a $500,000 settlement to the immigrant rights groups on this issue. And so it's wrong. People aren't allowed to intimidate people at the polls, but I think we're going to see a lot of that in a few weeks at the polls. It
sounds like you can't avoid it.
It's already started. He's already asking his people, in quotes. I mean, I guess the American people aren't his people. I mean, that's the issue. He's already has an us and them, my people and the rest of America. And that's the danger of that, right? So my people need to come out and observe, which is code word for harass, basically. And I think what they're trying to do is undermine the Voting Rights Act, the idea that in America, people should have the right to vote, that there shouldn't be restrictions on voting. And we're seeing the Republican Party continually trying to get rid of that belief and that value. We look at Texas. In Texas, have you ever driven through Texas? It's miles and miles of Texas. It's like you could drive for hours and not see anything. They've reduced the places you can turn in your ballots to one per county, which is thousands of miles away. If you're older, if you're sick, if you don't have a car, if you don't have transportation, you don't have a means to get someplace, or you're afraid of catching coronavirus if you go in public because you're a senior, what does that mean? It means basically your vote becomes disenfranchised, and that is their strategy. Disenfranchise as many possible non-Trump voters as possible. It's a tragedy, and it's so undemocratic.
Doctor, there's this idea on the right, on the far right, that the immigrant is a leech and they're here to take advantage, and they've traveled miles and miles and miles just because they want to take advantage of the system here in the United States to get health care and to get a good paying job. But the reality is that people, especially women, are fleeing these countries because of violence in their country, and they're risking their lives to go on this journey that is life or death. They are facing possibly getting raped or sexually assaulted, and they're still making the journey. So I'd love for you to describe what this idea of the immigrant is versus the reality of it.
Well, I mean, people who make a choice to leave their family, to leave their culture, leave a place where people love them, know them, respect them, speak their language, share their values. It's an extremely hard decision to make. I mean, you have to have conditions that are so extreme that you're willing to make that sacrifice. And it's from the people's view of the places people leave, these aren't criminals, these are heroes. These are people who are making the sacrifice to go someplace else, work under extremely difficult conditions, work in places where people harass you, they call you names, they blame you for everything, and yet they have the fortitude to work under those conditions and send money home to the people they left behind, to the family they left behind. And so in a sense, it depends on your perspective, but from the perspective of the people left behind, these are heroes. These are heroes who really, are celebrated all the time. The women you talk about who are leaving conditions of violence, sometimes it's violence with a spouse or boyfriend, sometimes it's violence against their kids from gangs, and they're making the heroic choice as well to undergo a journey that has so many problems in it, that's so many traumas, that when they get to the United States, if they make it, if they haven't been physically abused in some way, their psychological trauma is so extensive that they suffer, PTSD extremely badly, because it's a horrifying experience. In my interviews with women, they would do anything to avoid crossing the border on foot. I mean, they'd pay no matter what it would be to get taken across the border in a car in some way, right? With a fake passport or a fake border crossing card, or in the trunk of a car, anywhere, right? Just to avoid crossing that border on foot, because it's so dangerous and such a harrowing experience. And when they get here, the idea that somehow they're taking from America, let's look at the coronavirus epidemic and pandemic. Who's the frontline workers? Who's growing the food? Who's putting the food on the shelves? Who's taking food to people who are shut in? Who's taking care of the elderly? Who's doing all the things that people who can afford not to go out and expose themselves to coronavirus are doing? No, they're taking from America. They're making America possible to exist under this pandemic. That's why they're called frontline workers. And I wonder if the panic, or the anti-immigrant hysteria, has recognized that this contribution is being made. I mean, clearly they're getting sicker more often, they're dying more often, because they're making this major sacrifice to help America. I mean, there should be statues put up to these people who are here making the sacrifice, not condemnation. And yet, has Trump ever said thank you? Has Trump ever recognized who's getting sick more often than everyone else, and the kind of contribution they're making to helping our society overcome and exist during this pandemic? Where's the statue? Where's the thank you? It's almost unbelievable in its hypocrisy. And to continue saying somehow they're taking and they're a threat to America, it's unconscionable, if you want to know the truth.
He hasn't even mourned their deaths. He hasn't even mourned the deaths of over 200,000 people in this country alone. So I guess we cannot even expect him to honor people that are trying to just keep the world rolling. I want to pivot a little bit to
that would be a level of empathy that he doesn't seem able to have.
Right.
And I think recognizing that contribution would go against every political piece of rhetoric that he's put out there, that immigrants are a threat. To recognize them as not a threat, but a salvation. Wow. I mean, that would really be a 180-degree turn. And I think, unfortunately, if you were a smart person and you recognize your faults and were willing to say, I'm sorry, or I was wrong, he would do that. But he's not, almost all the evidence we've seen from people who've written about him, he's not able to do that. So.
But yet his supporters are finding a lot of empathy just in the last 12 hours. Suddenly they're so concerned and empathetic and sensitive. Very kind people all of a sudden. So I'm surprised.
There's how many people, if you look on the news, who say, wow, my husband caught coronavirus, or my wife caught coronavirus because they went to a rally, or they were at a meeting where he was at, or they worked at one of his places. And he never mentioned it. He never
Doesn't
said,
care. Herman Cain is dead.
Yeah.
Where's the empathy for that? Yeah.
None.
And I was just talking about Herman Cain. In a way, I liked him. And I didn't agree with any of his sentiments, but at least he had a sense of humor. That's one thing Trump lacks. And so, no matter for what all his faults, I was sad when Herman Cain got it and died. Where was the output of empathy for that? I mean, it's almost, no, he didn't get it from us. He did get it to your rally. It's just amazing the lack of sympathy that we see coming out of the White House. Now that they have it, of course, everyone's saying, well, maybe he should have worn a mask. Maybe it was wrong to have everyone, and he would chastise people for wearing a mask in his presence, right? Well, this is what happens.
Even at the recent debate, we've seen.
I hope Biden doesn't get it from that debate. I hope they were far enough apart that.
I hope so.
Because Trump was probably already affected.
Yeah, he was. He was, in fact. We talk a lot about, this negative sentiment of immigrants, and I want to pivot a little bit to birthright citizenship and anchor babies, which is a big bulk of your work. But I want to include a lot of immigrant groups, especially now we can talk about with coronavirus. There's Asian immigrants that are also being targeted. And I heard recently on a podcast, and I'm certain you are familiar with this, the first case that the United States fought with birthright citizenship was with an Asian Chinese. Actually, he was born here, but of immigrant parents. What did I just went blank on his name? I'm sure you know it. Wong Kim Ark, 1898, Wong Kim Ark, who was born in the United States, and they tried to kick him out, but he won.
I think with the 14th Amendment, which was really designed a lot for African-American slaves who were born in the United States but weren't recognized as citizens, the issue was still open. Well, what about the children of immigrants who came to this country? Are they citizens because they're born here, as the 14th Amendment says? And the key group that had so much anti-immigrant hysteria against were Asians, particularly Chinese, right? And so you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, you had the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. In all these cases, Asians were not allowed to become citizens because they weren't white. Citizenship was for white immigrants. And so the issue would be for people who didn't have the ability to become a citizen, with their children citizens if they were born in the United States. Well, the 14th Amendment makes no exclusions for where their parents come from or any political situation of their parents. And the case of Wong Kim Ark in 1898, the Supreme Court said very clearly, it doesn't matter what your parents' political status is. If you're born in the United States, you're an American citizen.
And here we are, 2020, Stephen Miller trying to fight that same constitutional amendment, trying to really overturn it and trying to challenge it. Will there be any success in that down the road?
Well, they've been trying to do, the Republican Party has put in amendments to the Constitution since about 1991, and almost every year since then, and it hasn't gone anywhere. Trump has fanned that flame pretty strongly, but on the other hand, the 14th Amendment is one of the key and fundamental values of this country at this point. The idea that people born here are citizens here is really hard to erase. It's really hard to get people to think negatively about that value and that idea. On the other hand, well, what do? If people feel so strongly positively about something called the 14th Amendment, let's create another term. Let's create the idea of the anchor baby, right? Because the anchor baby is sort of like the bastard brother of the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment says everyone's a citizen who's born here, they're good citizens. Well, the anchor baby is a bad citizen. They don't deserve to be here. They're here to take advantage of the United States. So they aren't like citizens like everyone else. So that's the way you create this idea that people born here, there's a group of people born here who aren't good people, like people born in the 14th Amendment. So maybe birthright citizenship shouldn't be extended to that group of people. I don't know if that rhetoric's going to hold, if people are going to say, because most people, when you ask them, should people born here be citizens, polls show, of course, right?
Doctor, but I feel like now that the Supreme Court potentially can lean to the right, we might get a head start by tackling the Trump administration, and the Republicans might get a head start on that by completely reversing DACA and destroying it. And it isn't anchor babies in that situation, but it's children that have been brought to this country that obviously were too young to make the decision for themselves. So I think that they do have an opportunity to start to chip away at that. And it's a little scary.
I think the DACA situation is a lot more vulnerable than anchor babies.
Yeah.
Because the idea of birthright citizenship is in the Constitution, right? It's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The issue of DACA is not. DACA was a presidential issue mandate by Obama, and the Supreme Court could go either way on that. In fact, of course, now that it becomes more conservative, it's not clear that they're going to back DACA, to the truth. And so what that would mean is that it would force Congress to come up with a solution, which is what they should have done a decade ago or more, that would allow people who are here in an undocumented status to find some way to regularize their status, not just for the kids who came here, but for everybody. I mean, when you have 11 million people, we need a process of regularization that allows people to change their status. And the DACA kids are just one aspect of that, but not the only aspect. I think people forget that in 1980, when Ronald Reagan and the first George Bush were running for president, they had a presidential debate like the one we just had. Someone asked from the audience, and this is before it was allowed, undocumented students were allowed to go to school, right? And someone asked, do you think the children of undocumented immigrants should be allowed to go to school at taxpayers' expense, or if their parents are undocumented? And you know what Ronald Reagan said? Of course they should. They should be allowed to go to school. They're here. They have roots here. There's no reason not for them to go to school, and they should become citizens. And so George Bush said, yes, of course. These are great people. These are good people. They set down roots in this country. It was, what happened from 1980 to today, where to have a Republican say those two things, and here are two key grandfathers of the Republican Party advocating for amnesty, and Ronald Reagan signed it into law when he became president. What happened? Why are the Republicans now so hostile to the idea that people who managed to acquire a life in the United States, have jobs, live a decent life, are able to change their status to become part of a legitimate?
Because white supremacy wants to give, but it doesn't want you to demand too much from it. It wants to give you a little something, but it doesn't want you to demand for your own rights and your own justice. Yeah. So when it does that, especially right now with the social movement that we've seen, it's frightening as hell to them, and they're going to do whatever it takes to maintain power, and that's scary.
I think the growth of the white supremacists that Trump's taken care of and has advocated for has really sort of made that hostility in some of the Republican Party very, very clear. Unfortunately, if Trump hadn't been elected, I don't think it would have been as much fuel to the fire for the white supremacists, because we would have had Democrats in office. And I think it would have been, and he's fuel, he's basically kept putting fuel on that fire, right? I think the polls show most Americans, however, agree with the idea that people should have a way to regularize their status, that there should be, reform. But at this point, you have Stephen Miller in the White House, who has the president's ear, who doesn't agree with that. And so, basically one person able to stall the will of the American people, which is really interesting to me.
What do we say to people like Melania Trump and countless others that say, come here legally, do it right? I think a lot of people really don't understand how the immigration process works, how each country has their own rules and quotas. Can you give us sort of like a Reader's Digest version of why is that possible? That just everybody just line up and come here legally? How realistic is that?
Well, number one, you mentioned Melania. I don't think she came legally. She came with some sort of work permit, which was actually questionable. And then she overstayed that. And then, she got lucky and got married. But the idea that somehow she stayed in some line and got here through some sort of process that everyone's supposed to, if everyone followed her example, we'd have the same situation we're in now. I think
there'd be a lot of naked pictures in the world.
Yeah, the example of basically she overstayed her visa.
All those anchor babies.
If she had, Trump himself's an anchor baby because his mother's a Scottish immigrant. But your question is what's the process to come to this country and work legally? very difficult from some states that have already overexceed their quotas, right? Every nation right now has about 20,000 quotas to come to this country. Some countries don't use hardly any of it because there's no need for them to come to the United States to work. My neighbor's Swiss. I mean, and they, she came undocumented. Her husband came legally. We came to go to school. Then he stayed and got legal. And the quota for Swiss is rarely ever used, right? Because they make so much money. Why would they come to the United States to work as dishwashers?
Wow.
On the other hand, you have a lot of people from countries like the Philippines, China, Korea, Mexico, who have more people who want to come to work and live than their allotments are. And they're attracted to the United States, particularly take Mexico, if you want to take Mexico, because of the kind of job opportunities that are offered for them. Because on our economy, we don't have enough people who want to work in certain kind of jobs, and people from certain countries see that as opportunity. And so if you were to wait for those kind of jobs, they would not be filled because there's not enough spaces in the system to allow people to come and take those jobs. And so what happens is you put pressure on the economy to attract people to take those jobs, and they come undocumented. In a system that worked fairly, you would have no illegal immigration. It'd be crazy to have illegal immigration because of all the problems it creates, right? For the people who come and the people who don't see them as being legitimate members of our nation. You would have a system that says, you know what, because we have an aging population, because we're having so few babies here in this country, and we have an economy that's growing that creates jobs, we need to expand the number of people coming in legally. So say, for example, 2 years ago, we had 300,000 people coming undocumented. Well, that should never happen. You should allow the 300,000 more people to come in to work legally because the economy needs it. But the problem is politics. The politicians and the economists and the Labor Department all know when the economy is booming, how many more immigrants we need to come into work. But if you're a senator or a congressperson and your constituents say, we don't want more immigrants, but you have all the studies that show we need more immigrants, they're going to say, well, I can't vote for more immigrants. And so they play this political game where the economy needs them, they'll come in and use them as undocumented workers. And so the political decision could be made by people who have the economy and the country at heart and say, wow, we don't want undocumented immigration. We need this many more immigrants. Let's just open up the doors to more immigrants. That is very politically difficult to do. And so you create the conditions within which undocumented immigration occurs, which creates problems down the line. For not only those people come to work, but then they create families, they have kids, and you have all these issues of anchor babies. And it could be avoided just by expanding the number of people you allow to come in legally to work. I mean, it just makes sense. That's a rational system. Unfortunately, immigration isn't a rational system.
No.
So that's what I would tell people is that, if you want to stand in line to work as a dishwasher, then fine, get in line. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who we need, and we just don't have enough people points in that line or doors in that line for people to come through to do all the work that people do. And it's not just dishwashers, but it's the kind of work that people need every single day. I mean, just think about it. How many immigrants you come in contact with every day? My parents-in-law are in hospice. We counted up one day, they have something like 6 or 7 or 8 immigrants every day practically coming to their house.
Wow. They
have 24-hour care, all immigrant women. They have a guy who comes to clean the house, he's a Polish immigrant. They have people who clean the yards who are Mexican immigrants. They have Filipino immigrants who are nurses. They have a guy who comes and cleans, bathes them, who's a Mexican immigrant. I mean, who cleans the yards, who cleans your houses, who picks your food, who puts the food on the table, who does your nails, who combs your hair, who cuts your, you can't even stop. You can't stop talking about the contribution of immigrants to everyday life.
Yeah. I mean, we're a nation of immigrants. I mean, this is part of what we celebrate as Americans. So it's quite shocking to see people take such a strong stance against something that they too came from. Unless you're a native, you also came from that. I want to switch a little bit before we end up the episode today about the uprising in the streets and the Black Lives Matter movement, and in the intersectionality between that and Latino immigration in particular. you've talked about in your book covering immigration that the 92 riots, the Rodney King riots, had as much to do with racial tensions between Latino immigrants and the Korean immigrant entrepreneurs as it did with white officers and Black citizens. Does police brutality bring out these racial tensions more and more division amongst minority groups?
I think the Black Lives Matter issue with the Latino communities has been one where people see that, the police are finally being recognized as thugs in many cases, right? I mean, here in Los Angeles, we had the problem of police officers illegally claiming that all these Latino youth were gang members and used it in their convictions. Now those are all being looked at again and overturned. And I think what the intersection between, I think, Black Lives Matter and Brown Lives Matter and any other lives matter is that, is that a recognition that sometimes some police are out of control. Not all police, but some police are out of control, and there has to be some way of controlling that and dealing with that. And so I see what's going on having some sort of positive, I think, ripple effect across a lot of different, because now we're seeing a lot more circumstances where Latinos are being harassed by police or killed. And it's getting in the press more where people probably wouldn't have even thought about it as much, right? It's just, oh, they're gang members or there's something, which wasn't true. I mean, there are people who are being killed and harassed just as much as anyone else. And I think if you go back historically, if you look at the lynchings that have occurred, for example, and another issue where there's an overlap that people historically have failed to recognize, Blacks were lynched a lot in the South, but once you get down towards the Southwest, it was Latinos were lynched. My family was lynched a lot in New Mexico. In Texas, the lynchings were mainly Latinos because they had to pacify, after the Mexican-American War, pacify the Southwest. And you pacify through a reign of terror, right? That's what the Texas Rangers were about. That's what a lot of law was about in the post-1850 period. Then you come even further west. The lynchings were Chinese. The anti-Chinese sentiment, and the Chinese somehow are somehow here to take advantage of the United States. Even in downtown LA, riots were anti-Chinese riots back in 1850s, 1860s. And you know who the police were? Latinos.
Yeah.
And so
that sort of talks to my point, because there seems to be infighting. I mean, in a time when we should be united as people of color, there is infighting. You have Latinos saying, oh, Black Lives Matter. What about kids in cages? Do they matter? So is that like an effect of colonization, of trying to divide and create that tension amongst different racial groups?
Well, I think obviously that happens a lot. I think keep people divided. I'm hoping that the whole issue of police brutality and killings is something that people can see across those lines of division at this point, because they're so brutal and so clear that they should be. I think on the Black Lives Matter side, they tend to often mention brown lives and Latinos as well, right? Yeah. So it's interesting to see what happens.
I'm curious, Dr. Chavez, what your thoughts are. I know that Los Angeles itself has a history about police brutality and riots, like you mentioned as well. What are your thoughts on the fact that there was this secret organization within some of the cops, or the secret group of white supremacy, and some Latinos were also part of that group as well? I think there's like an internal investigation trying to figure out what all those details are.
Well, it's despicable. I think obviously, if you can't trust the law enforcement, who can you trust? So I think the problem has been that there's been a lot of protection of those kind of rogue policemen. And I think that's where you have to have this movement for some sort of public oversight is really important, because it sows so much fear of the police, a lack of willingness to cooperate with the police. When you think the police are the thugs, well, who's going to protect you? Right? Well, maybe the gangs will protect us. I mean, it becomes a crazy war situation. And so, when you have that kind of renegade police officers, that has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with very clearly. It has to be dealt with very publicly. And I think if you want to restore any sort of faith in the police, it should be done very, very soon and very rapidly and very fast. We unfortunately, that kind of treatment of minority communities in Los Angeles has been the norm rather than the exception. Up until probably the 80s, right? It was pretty common to see that sort of thing. Think about the Zoot Suit riots. I mean, the police stood by while white Navy people, but went into East LA and beat up zoot suiters. I mean, and it was, and the language used in the LA Times and the LA Examiner and others was that, that these guys got their lesson. They were taught what it means to be American. And these were kids going off to war that were being beat up, right? And so, unfortunately, Los Angeles has had a very strong history of control over the Latino and other communities here. And unfortunately, when you see some of these issues like you're talking about, we have these rogue policemen coming in, it reminds us of that history, and it has to be dealt with. I mean, otherwise this... Is
it rogue though? Are they rogue, or is this the systemic racism that we're talking about? Are they rogue? Is that the exception, or is it the rule?
I think that extreme is rogue. And when you have a group of people who actually wear certain kinds of emblems, certain kinds of tattoos, they form an organization within an organization. I mean, that's such extreme behavior, right? That I think many people in the police force would feel that is not something that should be tolerated. Unfortunately, we have. But
it has been tolerated. But it has been tolerated, and it wasn't until spotlights have been put on it.
It's been tolerated because the union is so strong that almost any police officer who commits.
Oh, please expand on that one, Doctor.
Not this extreme group you're talking about, but just everyday police abuse that we've seen, like the guy who put his knee on the neck of the black guy and killed him, right? Who comes out right away to protect these crazy police officers is the union. The union just doesn't want to see police officers somehow pay the price for their kind of behavior. And that kind of gives a license, as you say, to a much more systematic, not just rogues who go off in some intergroup craziness, but everyday police systematic oppression and bad treatment is sort of okayed by the unions. They give them protection. And I think that has to be rethought. Why are those unions so powerful? Well, they vote, I guess, number one, but the way that they're so protective that anybody almost can do whatever they want, and the union is going to be on their side, which is really, I think that's a tragic. I'm not against unions. I think unions are important to protect the rights of workers, but when it goes over, like in this case, where it doesn't matter what you do, kill somebody, put your knee on someone's neck and suffocate them, and the union comes out and says, well, maybe it was justified.
Yeah. Or shoot a woman in her own home when she's just doing nothing inside there.
It's justified. I mean, these are, to me, problematic kind of stances. I think if the union was really more rational and want to protect the police in general, they would say, well, we're going to make sure people who do stuff like that get prosecuted so that the public sees we're not protecting them. But that's not their position.
What about the police being used as arms of ICE? And we hear now there's going to be more raids in sanctuary cities in particular. And we have these, police forces that are local police now being sort of mobilized in arms of immigration officers as well. Like they're like an extension of them. Is that something we're going to see more of? And has this always been the case?
Well, that's been for a while that the administration has had the power to try and deputize really the police into being ICE agents. But many police organizations don't want that because, but some do. Some go along with it, some don't. Even within a jurisdiction like Orange County and Los Angeles, you have, one group of police willing to serve and help ICE, and other groups saying, no, you can't come in here because it wrecks our system of community policing. The community can't have faith in us if they think we're ICE agents. And so it's the police, the different parts of the police force are very, I think hostile to some of this, and some are very favorable. Yeah. And so it's not a blanket kind of use of the police. Los Angeles has been pretty effective in not doing that, but the sheriff's department has been. And so it's kind of interesting how that's being played out. And but the ICE and President Trump would really much like to see local police being agents of ICE. Yeah. The trouble is, I think how many ICE raids have we seen on lately since the pandemic on because of these workers who are the frontline workers, and you remove them, who's going to do that work? it's kind of interesting, you know,
They're not raiding the chicken plants right now. They took a pause.
because there's so much coronavirus in the meat poultry and processing industry, that if they took those workers out to the greater extent than they did just months ago, we'd all have no food to eat. And so I think there's a certain recognition of that at this point, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
But once the pandemic's over, there'll probably be a return to that kind of problem, that kind of harassment.
And even those people there, I mean, that's part of the dehumanization, the criminalization, and the otherness. You know, they're just objects within capitalism. We need them to sort of function economically, but when we want to.
Yeah, you ever brought it up? One of the things I work on is reproduction. And one of the issues of reproduction is around the idea that being birthed out or out reproduced in places like the United States or Europe because of immigrants or brown women. And that idea that led to eugenics back in the early 1900s, where, you know, who reproduced was part of politics. And you had almost every politician and scientist in California, particularly in other places, saying, no, low-class people and non-white immigrants shouldn't reproduce. Well, look what's now happening in the detention centers, where Latinas are being given hysterectomies and being made infertile, really against their will, because they're not told what's really going on, is a complete relationship to this idea that, well, if we make fewer brown women unable to have babies, somehow we're going to win in this reproductive war. And that goes back for 100 and something years with eugenics and that whole idea of controlling reproduction through.
Yeah, they've done it to Native women. They've done it to Black African women. They've done it to Latinas. I mean, even here in Los Angeles, as recent as the 60s, they were doing it at County General.
But now they're doing it on the border at our detention centers. I mean, it's almost unbelievable that they went to that level and that kind of.
Who's making this call? Who's deciding?
On women's bodies, it's just unbelievable, right? Yeah. It's just unbelievable, but it fits into this pattern of reproductive war that's going on.
That's a great question, Viviana. Who's deciding on these decisions? Like who's making these decisions to do these procedures?
That's great. And now that how long would it have gone on if some lawyer or some reporter hadn't caught it? I mean, it'd still be going on.
If we didn't have that whistleblower from within.
She was a whistleblower from within.
Exactly. That's somebody you might want to contact and figure all that out. How did this start? Who gave permission to do this? How many women were actually had it done to them? And what was the rationale, really? I mean, was it just some crazy doctor acting on his own eugenic mentality, or was it was the administration actually pushing this? I would like to know the answer to that, and it hasn't come out. So that might be your next one. If you do find someone out there, invite me back, because I'd love to talk to them.
Arlene and I will do some investigative reporting, and we'll get back to you.
Anyway, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Chavez. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Doctor.
I thought your sister was going to be here too, but
I know. I told she's camping. She's always my sister has a master's in anthropology. You're her favorite professor, so she was a little bit disappointed. So we'll have to call you back. Before you go, how do you think this election is going to go? Do you think Trump might take it?
It depends how much discord he can sow, and how much the Republicans are going to go in certain states that are key battle states and try to just muck up the whole election and find some way to allow Republican legislatures in those states to make the decision on who won in those states. And if it's almost it's scary to see what kind of level of undemocratic kind of policies people are thinking of in some of those states. But I'd like to see the vote be so great that it's an avalanche and we just throw the bums out.
Yes,
that would be the ideal. So there's no question. It's a hurricane. It's a tsunami.
I love it.
That basically we wash them out, and that would be the deal.
And I hope the tsunami is brown Latino voters.
But I think even too, women voters. I mean, that debate with the kind of ugly testosterone-driven shouting and insults that were going on by Trump.
Emotional.
I can't imagine that anybody who has any sense of what decorum is about and how you treat people fairly and how you conduct a rational discussion would think that is the kind of America we want. Now, some women live with husbands who do that sort of thing. So maybe it's just common. Maybe that's just the way they think life should be. But man, I don't think many women, I hope he lost the women's vote at that point.
Well, we've thought a lot of things were going to stop his voters from backing him, but hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
Dr. Chavez, thank you so much. I'm going to this is going to be the quote of the day. Throw the bums out. Esteemed professor from UCI, Dr. Leo Chavez. Check out his books if you guys haven't already. You can find them on Amazon. Amazing insight into all of these issues. I appreciate it. I appreciate you, Arlene, as well, and your contributions to the conversation. And we will see you again, Dr. Chavez. I'll bring my sister on so you can have a nice chat with her.
Hey, take it easy. Have fun.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks
guys.
again. Bye.
Bye.